All right, folks, let's get this started. So as you know, this is the second time I'm recording this, but I think this is actually going to go much better. Let me get my timer started here. Sorry for the slow start. I'm out of practice on this. Okay, there we go. So this is on the brain. And there it is. There's the technical diagram of the brain. You should be able to describe the location and function of the department of thoughts. Here's what I'm actually going to talk about. And for this lecture, I think I'm just going to go through these three parts. So it's a little bit about what I introduced in class on Monday, the evolution of the brain and kind of its organization. Talk about the structure and function of the different parts of the brainstem. Talk about the limbic system. And then in class on Thursday and Friday, we'll do the cerebral cortex and the hemispheres. So at least for the class of 2021-22 school year, we talked about brain evolution and a little bit in class, and the idea that the human brain is didn't evolve from scratch, but has this structure we have evolved from earlier mammals, which evolved from earlier vertebrates, reptiles, and amphibians, and even before that, the simplest animals with the nervous system. And as we went along, old structures got bigger, new structures developed and evolved, and old structures maybe got new functions. And that's how we ended up with today. And just another quick example, you look at the shark. Early type of it's a bony fish, but actually I think it's a little bit different than the other types of fishes. Alligator, an amphibian, and the horse, a mammal, very different brains. And you see in the shark, the olfactory bulb is big and well developed, bigger than in the alligator, and definitely bigger than in the horse, and that is the part of the brain that deals with your sense of smell. But the cerebrum, which is pretty much the cortex plus a few other structures, so it's kind of the advanced processing part of the brain. You can see in the shark, it's barely even there. I don't know why I lost my pen. And then in the alligator, it's bigger. And in the horse, it's much, much bigger. And in fact, it's got that wrinkly surface to it to actually increase the surface area in a small space. So you don't have to memorize any of that, but just that's an example of the changes through millions of years of evolution in the brain. Here I want you to take a guess. On the top we have the side view of a cross section of the human brain. You can see different structures in there. And then below it we have a brain of a different animal, similar to side view cross section. And you can see the cerebellum. You can see the hippocampus is very big in this animal. The olfactory bulb is very big. The pituitary gland is very big. But the cortex is much smaller. So take a moment before I tell you the answer to guess what type of animal you think that is. And that is actually the brain of a rat. And as we'll learn, rats have very great memories for kind of where they've stored food and the paths they take in and around their domain. So their hippocampus is very big. Their sense of smell is very well developed. Their hypothalamus and the control of the endocrine system and the pituitary gland are very big. But the advanced processing areas are nowhere near as big as they are in a human. And these structures I'm going to talk about later in the lecture developed in early mammals, the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, and those are part of the limbic system. Okay, so spend a minute or two on this slide. You can kind of divide the human brain up into three separate parts. One way to talk about them is the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. And you'll see that sometimes. And I'm not going to really focus on those terms because what is more useful is to talk about the lower brain, which is pretty much equivalent to the hindbrain. And the lower brain are these structures here. It includes the brain stem, that I'm going to talk about in a little bit, and the cerebellum. And that can be thought of as kind of the reptilian brain because those structures were all present in early reptiles and amphibians. And it controls all the kind of instinctive behaviors that don't require cognition or conscious awareness or thinking. Regulating of the heart and breathing and the organs, kind of thermostatic or homeostatic regulation of the body, and some early sensory processing. What developed in early mammals was this limbic brain, where memory and emotion kind of originated. And then the advanced part, and advanced is a loaded term because every animal is kind of advanced and suited to the niche it fills, but the cortex is the thinking part of our brain. So those would be the three divisions that I'm going to focus on. The lower part of the brain, what is often nicknamed the reptilian brain, the limbic system, associated with early mammals, and the cortex. You can see I've got a few slides that kind of show the same thing. Reptilian brain down here, early mammal, more advanced mammals, and then us, where the front of the cortex, the prefrontal cortex, is the part that is most different in us from other higher primates and other mammals. I don't like this one as much. I think I'm going to take it off because we've since, in the last 10 or 15 years, we've really made advances in thinking about octopi, and even though they're invertebrates, they are very, very intelligent in just a very different way. So this part of it is probably inaccurate, but you have the same thing there again, reptiles and amphibians, mammals, higher mammals, humans. And this is reversed, so the frontal lobe is up here in the frontal cortex. Same thing again, reptilian, old mammalian in the limbic system, neocortex, and then the prefrontal cortex advanced, and you see it represented here again by the different animals. Keep in mind, monkeys are not the same as apes, but any kind of baboon or monkey would have this advanced cortex, and then the only animals that really have this advanced prefrontal cortex like us would be the cetaceans, like whales and porpoises and dolphins, and the apes, and just the great apes, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, bonobos, and us. There's one other class of ape called gibbons that are smaller and are the lesser apes, and they don't not quite as complicated a brain. Okay, so that's the first part, the kind of evolutionary part. I'm 8 minutes in. I'm not doing great, but I'm kind of on track. Now I'm going to talk about the lower part of the brain, sometimes called the hindbrain. And we have 4 structures here, but you have to pay attention not to be confused by this because this slide is not perfect for my purposes, but it's the best one it's closest to what I want. So the 4 structures I'm going to talk about are the medulla, the pons, the reticular formation, and back here the cerebellum. Before I end this page, I'll talk about the thalamus, but it's not really part of the lower brain. The lower brain are these structures here. So you can see where the spinal cord will come up into the neck and into the head, and at a certain point, so there's the spinal cord. right about, here, it thickens. Here, it kind of thickens just a little bit. And so this structure here, where it first thickens, is where the brain really begins. And it's called the brain stem. This part, the medulla and the pons. The medulla controls all of these, all these structures, the medulla, the pons, and reticular formation, control what you might call more primitive functions, the kind of unthinking regulation of our body that our brain handles without us being consciously aware of. And the medulla handles kind of vital functions, is what I would note for that. And specifics would be things like heart rate, breathing, blood pressure, and even some reflexes like sneezing and coughing and blinking. Um, I want to spend just a minute or two talking about how it does that. Um, this is a little advanced, but I think it's important that you realize like um, how this kind of not very advanced part of the brain is doing it. And what's going on is, let's take heart rate. There are receptors um, in your blood vessels that are chemoreceptors, and they're kind of in your arteries, in your veins, that will detect changes in the acidity of the blood. And those signals, blood's getting more acidic because you've been doing a lot of exercising or something like that, or it's less acidic, and indicate whether you need, your heart to pump faster or slower, and maybe need more oxygen. So get that heart pumping. Those chemoreceptors send signals to the medulla, and the medulla is like a simple thermostat. It just is kind of switching on and switching off if the signals that get sent about the acidity of the blood become too high. Then it's like a heater turning on. It will, the thermostat will click over, and it'll say, okay, we need to slow the heart down or speed it up. And so it's a very kind of automatic regulation. That's just one example, but that kind of gives you a sense of the way the medulla works. Onto the pons. The pons is this puffy little pillow thing that kind of sits on top of the medulla. And it is related to things like sleep and dreaming and arousal. And so again, kind of unthinking, your alertness level or your arousal. And there are two additional things, one about the medulla and one about the pons, that you should know about. For the medulla, there's something that is where sensory crossover takes place. And what sensory crossover is that your brain is actually contralateral, meaning that the left side of your body, and you've probably heard this, is actually processed on the right side of your brain. So any skin sensations in your left foot or your left arm are actually detected and processed in the right side of your brain. And the crossover from the left side to the right and vice versa for sensory nerves happens in the medulla. So that's where the sensory crossover takes place. For the pons, it's the reverse. Motor commands come out of the cortex and descend down the brainstem, and they actually cross over at the pons. So pons is where motor crossover takes place, so that your left side of your brain controls the right side of your body and vice versa, and that crossover of those nerves happens at the pons. Just make sure I'm not forgetting anything. I think we're good on both of those. The third structure is a reticular formation. Inside the pons and the medulla is a bundle of fibers, of nerve fibers, and they're depicted in blue here. That's the reticular formation. And the reticular formation is kind of like a filter in the lower part of your brain related to attention. So it's kind of what are you going to pay attention to in the conscious part of your brain or not. And what the reticular formation does is it is filtering out any kind of unchanging sensory info. In terms of our sensory systems, we don't really want to focus on things in the environment that aren't changing at all. We want to focus on what's different, what's changed, what's new. Is the sound getting louder? Is the sound getting dimmer? Is that thing in my vision getting bigger or smaller, etc.? So our system is designed to detect change, and we'll learn more about that in the sensation and perception unit. The reticular formation is part of that evolution to focus on change. So what the reticular formation does is it filters out and ignores constant unchanging info, but it's alert to changes. And it kind of works with the pons a little bit in terms of sleep. So you may very well sleep through noises in the night. You're hearing them. Your ears are picking them up. They're still getting sent into the brainstem and up through the reticular formation. But the reticular formation is evolved to cut those noises out and not allow them to startle us and wake us. But some sounds get through. You're more likely to awaken if you hear your name. A parent is more likely to awaken if they hear their babies cry. And so the reticular formation is that filter that is alert to changes and certain sounds that are kind of high priority for us. So that's the third one. And the system, the name given to that system in the reticular formation is something called the reticular activating system. So that's the three structures on the brainstem. The pons has one more function. It acts as a bridge between the cerebellum and the cortex. So communication between the cerebellum and the cortex goes back and forth through the pons. Let's talk about this fourth and final structure, the cerebellum. So on the left here, it is this structure that sits at the base of your brain in the back. Here, you see there are actually two of them, one in each hemisphere. And they look to some people like little brains. And so cerebellum is a Latin version of little brain. And what the cerebellum is responsible for is, I'm going to use this term now to introduce it, but I don't really want you to use it on the test. It's not technically accurate, but it's responsible for what we often call muscle memory. And I don't like that, what does that mean? It's the memory of how to do kind of complicated coordinated movements with our muscles, what's sometimes called fine motor skills or skilled voluntary movement. I don't like the term muscle memory because it makes it seem like the muscles themselves are remembering how to move, and that's obviously not accurate. It's the brain that is storing the instructions for how to do something like hold a pen properly, or walk, or crawl, or to more complicated things like ride a unicycle, swing a tennis racket or a baseball bat in a way that you're going to be successful hitting it, that kind of smooth motion. Whenever you learn a new sport or a dance move or something, and you get to the point where you can do it without thinking about it, then that means that kind of set of instructions has been stored in your cerebellum. And that's why if you have to explain how to do something that you can do without thinking, driving, some sort of coordinated physical action. It can be hard to describe the steps because your cerebellum isn't where you consciously think about it. You just do it. If you have to consciously think about it, now it's the cortex part of your brain that is trying to verbally explain it, and that's not where the instructions reside. So that can be difficult for us as we kind of try to access the cerebellum, which isn't necessarily linked that well to the cortex. So let me summarize, sorry, puberty there, summarize what the things that the cerebellum is responsible for. The main thing would be skilled voluntary movement or fine motor control. So those are words to describe any kind of coordinated set of movements our muscles or our body needs to take to perform some sort of action, which could be as simple as playing a musical instrument, riding some sort of bike or vehicle, doing a dance move, anything like that, any kind of sporting move is stored in the cerebellum. That's probably the main one. There are other things as well. Involuntary movement, which are things our body does that we don't actually kind of consciously control. Like you think to yourself, like, let's start walking now. You're doing that on purpose, or you do some sort of dance move. You're doing that consciously and voluntarily. So that's called voluntary movement. But involuntary movement would be any kind of body muscle changes that your body's kind of doing on its own without you thinking about it. And the cerebellum controls those as well. And a third thing that I'm not really going to explain in depth right now, but I will in the memory unit, is something called procedural memory. So the final thing that the cerebellum stores is any kind of sequence of instructions, like how a sentence, the proper order to say a sentence or something like that. And so it's like the sequence of instructions that you're going to do. So it doesn't have to be a physical movement, but any kind of memory we have of a series of things we need to do in order to like say something or to write something or do any. It doesn't have to be physical. That's not a very good explanation of procedural memory, but I'm going to go on. So to recap, the cerebellum, which is obviously the most complicated of these lower brain parts of structures, deals with storing the skilled voluntary movements, involuntary movements, and procedural memory. Okay, I'm at 22 minutes. I need to do one more slide and then I'll close it up. The thalamus, I'm just going to talk about. It shouldn't really be on this slide, but I'm going to explain it since it's here. It's not part of the lower brain. It is kind of this in-between structure that acts as a relay station for all the sensory information that comes into the brain except for smell. So, but all the other senses pass through the thalamus, and the thalamus is like a distribution center or like an Amazon distribution center, getting the sound, visual, taste information to the proper parts of the cortex. Everything passes through the thalamus and then it distributes it on. Okay, the last thing is the limbic system. You have the limbic system is interesting because it is not a structure. These pieces of the brain are not structurally related to each other, really. They are all sort of in the same general area, but they are functionally related loosely in that they all kind of deal with somewhat similar things having to do with memory and primitive emotions. And even that is a stretch because I think the hypothalamus and the pituitary glands are somewhat different themselves. But these four structures together, hypothalamus, pituitary gland, amygdala, and hippocampus, together are known as the limbic system. What's interesting, can't get my pen going here, is that three of the four are in the brain, but the pituitary gland is part of the endocrine system, and so it's part of the limbic system and the endocrine system, but it's not part of the brain. Okay. Let me say what the limbic system is one more time just to get it straight. It's memory, learning, emotion, and our drives, like those urges and things that we feel compelled to do. That's probably a better explanation of it overall. Memory, learning, emotion, and drives. So I'll talk first about, let me do the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is one of the structures in the brain that you will probably come to know the best. And it has to do with the formation of memory. So when we learn something new or form a new memory, the hippocampus is involved and has to be there in order for us to form a new memory. And it is this structure that kind of spirals around almost like a ram's horn or something, um, and thickens just at the end here. Somebody used to think it originally thought it looked like a seahorse, which it really doesn't, so that's why it's called a hippocampus. That's Latin for seahorse. You actually have two of them, one in each hemisphere, like two ram's horns. Jimmy G, um, with his alcoholism, damaged his hippocampus. That was the part of the brain he damaged. And that was why, after a certain point, he could not form any new memories. And he thought, he was stuck back in time around World War II. The amygdala. That is, sorry, yawning, this almond shaped structure here, very small. And it has to do, it's primarily associated with fear and emotional memories about things that we fear, and it is going to activate whenever we are frightened. And it's going to be kind of a rapid response to initiate action, often involving the autonomic nervous system. The hypothalamus, and I'll have more to say about the amygdala in class on Wednesday. The hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is, I mentioned in some of the classes on Monday, it is one of the smallest structures in the brain, but maybe plays the most pivotal role. And it has to do with various kind of drives and maintenance functions. So the hunger drive, our thirst drive, maintaining a stable internal body temperature. The hypothalamus, again, kind of like I talked about with the medulla, acts as a little bit of a thermostat, getting feedback from the body and then sending kind of signals out to either, make the body shiver so we warm up or to cool it down with sweating. It is called the hypothalamus because it sits just hypo or under the thalamus, which is that kind of egg-shaped structure that we saw on the previous slide here. The hypothalamus functions in two ways. One is through the autonomic nervous system that most of the classes talked about on Monday. So that is part of the peripheral nervous system where the hypothalamus is sending signals through the nervous system to, say, other glands, or to glands like the adrenal gland to release adrenaline. It's also acting through the endocrine system because it's sending signals to the pituitary gland, which is sending signals through hormone release to other glands in the body. And the pituitary gland, as you probably learned in bio, is known as the master gland. It kind of is involved in regulating the other glands. One last thing about the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is sometimes referred to as dealing with the 4 Fs, and that is not totally accurate, but 4 Fs would be fight or flight, so that's recognizing its role, as we've already talked about, in the autonomic nervous system. Food, or the hunger drive, so that's the third one, that doesn't mention things like thirst and stable body temp. but you could do like freezing, I guess. And then the last one is it plays a role in the release of reproductive hormones, so our sex drive. And so the final F would be whatever you want to use as that F. I'm going to stick with fornication. Um, so that's the limbic system, probably the most interesting of parts of the brain or system in the brain. What I'm going to wait for is to talk tomorrow, but a little bit more about the amygdala and then the cortex. So I'm going to shut this off now. We're right about a little over 30 minutes. Thanks very much. I'll see you in class on Wednesday.